Welcome to today's web briefing, The State of New Jersey's Nonprofit Community. I'm Linda Czipo, President and CEO of the Center for Nonprofits, and I am very excited to present today's session. Joining me behind the curtain is Susan Merrill O'Connor, Communications Specialist here at the Center. The Center for Nonprofits is New Jersey's state association for the nonprofit community. For 35 years, the Center has existed to strengthen New Jersey's nonprofits individually and collectively in order to improve the quality of life for the people of our state. If your organization is a member of the Center, we thank you for your support and involvement as we pursue this work together. If you're not a member, we invite you to join us and experience firsthand how membership can work for you. The Center, along with 40 other state associations of nonprofits across the country, is part of the National Council of Nonprofits, the nation's largest national network of nonprofit organizations. It's a great way for us to leverage our work, gather intel from around the country, and if you know nonprofits in other states, please encourage them to check out this network. It's absolutely fabulous. Before we dive in, I just want to call your attention to some upcoming programming that you might be interested in. We are partnering with the Nonprofit Finance Fund to present a series of webinars focusing on planning, financial management, and other aspects of nonprofit operations. These webinars started in late March, but they'll be going on through May and even into June. Members of the Center can get discounts on some individual sessions, so feel free to check that out. More information on our website. Also coming up on May 22nd, also details to be announced, we will be partnering with the New Jersey Theater Alliance to present 2 half-day sessions on the same day, one focusing on tax reform for nonprofits and the other around nonprofits and sexual harassment. So those are 2 very important topics that you might not want to miss. More information about these and many other offerings is on our website. And I certainly want to make sure you save the date for our annual conference. This year it will be on December 5th, 2018 in Somerset. It's a great chance for you to network, be inspired, and learn from great speakers as well as 500 wonderful leaders from the nonprofit and for-profit communities. Today's webinar attendees represent a diverse array of perspectives, including nonprofits, for-profits, and members of the media. I would like to thank the Horizon Foundation for New Jersey and Sobel & Company, LLC, Certified Public Accountants and Consultants, for generously supporting this year's survey. Right now, I'd like to invite Jonathan Pearson, Executive Director of Corporate Responsibility at Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield New Jersey and Executive Director of the Horizon Foundation for New Jersey, and Sally Glick, Principal and Chief Growth Strategist at Sobel and a board member of the Center for Nonprofits, to say a couple of words before we begin. Sally, John?
John, you want to go first?
Sally, why don't you go first?
Okay, ladies first. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be a part of this. Sobel has been long active in the nonprofit community. We serve that as service providers, but we also are engaged in the fact of bringing resources and support, doing things like this kind of survey and sponsoring it, specifically because we are so committed to the nonprofit community. One thing I would say, and then I don't think I need to say more, on our website, we mention that clients ask us why we do this, why are we so involved in the nonprofit space as a CPA firm serving New Jersey in the New York metropolitan area. And our partners in charge of our practice group say the same thing every time. We do what we do because we are proud to be able to help those who are more vulnerable, who need our help, the nonprofit community as a group. And so it's not just another audit, it's not just an opportunity to gain a client. It's really a responsibility we feel strongly about in terms of our dedication to making sure that everybody in the nonprofit space has good access to the right kind of information to help them be successful. So that's why we do what we do. Thank you, Linda, and thank you, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Jonathan Pearson with Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield New Jersey. Sally, it's great to partner with you and Sobel on this important document and key insights specific to the nonprofit community and nonprofit organizations in working throughout New Jersey. I want to thank Linda for her leadership on this. And I'd just like to say that this has been a terrific piece of insight and document that we actually make it actionable at Horizon. And what I mean by that is, as we go through our kind of strategic grant making and distribution of our resources, even through our foundation, or through our community affairs work, specifically with the nonprofit organizations throughout New Jersey, we look at this trend report and we make changes to our strategy that supports a lot of the insights that are really highlighted significantly. And one example would be for 2018, we are launching a skills-based volunteer program with our 5,500 employees here at the company. And one of the insights based on this trend report was really calling out the fact that nonprofits do not have the resources always to hire talent to take on projects such as maybe building a strategy or communication or marketing plan. So we're going to address that, we hope, with some of our associates, and we're actually promoting that next week during our national volunteer activities here at the company. So again, we're glad to be part of it. I want to thank Linda and her team. It's a terrific piece of information and document, and again, at Horizon, it's something that we're making actionable, and it's a great resource to have. So thank you, appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, Sally. Both Sobel and Horizon have been so supportive of the nonprofit community and of the center specifically, and we really appreciate that. And really looking forward to hearing about the skills-based volunteer program and the other items you have in the pipeline. So let's dive in. What are we going to cover today in the time we have available? We'll go talk a little bit about the nonprofit community generally. We'll go over the highlights of the survey findings for this year. We'll talk a little bit about what this means and what we can do about it. And hopefully this will give you some food for thought, some food for action, as John was just talking about, and maybe spur some questions. And as I said, if you have questions, type them into the chat box. I'll get to them if time permits. And if not, we will follow up afterward with an email with a link to the survey, the slides, and other information that you might find useful. And if there are any loose ends, we'll wrap them up in the follow-up email. I do think that in some ways I'm preaching to the choir for some of this presentation, but it always bears repeating. Nonprofits matter. They matter in so many different ways, but when people think about why nonprofits matter, they often think about the work that nonprofits do, the mission-based work, from disaster response to public radio to education, philanthropy, social justice, human services, the arts, inspiration, and any number of things that would take a day and more to cover. Point here, of course, is that nonprofits touch every aspect of our lives every single day, even when we may not realize it. But the other half of this equation is that nonprofits matter economically. Nonprofits employ about 10% of the private workforce in New Jersey. Nonprofits collectively spend $38 billion with a B every year, much of that in the Garden State. We employ 314,000 people, that's probably higher by now. And there are 34,000 nonprofits, 501c3s in the state of New Jersey. Many are small, but collectively, nonprofits have an extraordinary and indispensable impact on the state. So that's one of the reasons why we do this survey. We want to make sure that we are taking a pulse of the nonprofit community. What's going on? What are some of the trends? What do we need to be concerned about? What are the opportunities? What do we need to pay attention to? And how can we take this information and bring it to bear with policymakers, our partners in philanthropy, folks in government, business, and the public and the media? So this information is critically important, and back to what John said about it being actionable, this is why your response matters. So I would like to thank every nonprofit that did take the time to complete the survey, and many of you respond year in and year out. We really, really do appreciate that. So for those of you who have been part of these sessions before or read our press survey, some of these findings may not come as a big surprise. The first and most important finding is that demand for the nonprofit services in the state of New Jersey continues to go up. This is a national trend. It's not unique to New Jersey, but every year when we do this survey, some 3/4-ish or more of our respondents say that demand for services went up in the past year. This year it happened to be 71% rather than 75%, but you're still talking about a sizable majority. We also asked organizations, what do you think is going to happen in the year to come? And nearly 80% said that they felt that demand was going to continue to rise in 2018. By way of a reminder, this survey was conducted in January of this year. And the responses, the findings are based on the responses of 252 organizations. Now, rising demand is something that you would expect, rising need. The other issue, of course, is what does this mean for nonprofits? Are they able to meet this need? And that's where we get some serious questions. This graph is a little bit busy. There's another one in the report. But basically, the gist here is that the resources are not keeping pace with the demand. We have a situation where for example, take private foundations. The beige bar on the right is no significant change in funding. The orange bar in the middle is decreased funding between 2017 versus the year before, and the dark red is increased funding. So what we're seeing here is that for private foundations, of course, which is where many nonprofits get, in our survey, get their funds, flat funding outweighed either decreases or increases. Similarly, for corporate donations, 44% of our respondents said that their corporate donations stayed level, while 15% received a decrease and 25% received an increase. Individuals were a little bit of a brighter spot. 41% of our respondents who received donations from individuals actually experienced increased funding. There may have been a bump because of tax reform. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that increases in donations from individuals actually did outweigh decreases or flat funds. The only other category where that was true was in special events, where also organizations had a little bit better success than in some of our other areas. Basic message here is that flat funding is the norm, and unfortunately, demand keeps going up. The funding is not keeping pace. This is going to be a recurring theme throughout this presentation. How else is this gap manifesting itself? Remember, we have 71% of respondents who said demand for services went up in 2017. Unfortunately, only 42% said their funding went up in the same period, and 56% said that their expenses had gone up. So we've got a real disconnect between the rising demand, the funding, and the expenses. Of our respondents, only 28% reported taking in more money than they spent last year. What that means is that either you've had break even or you've got situations where the funding is not keeping pace, meaning organizations spent more than they took in. In those cases, organizations are either tapping into reserves, they're delaying paying vendors, they're trying to juggle a lot, and clearly over time this is not a recipe for sustainability. How else are resources not keeping pace? Nearly 2/3 of our respondents predicted that expenses would continue to increase in 2018. And remember, 77% said that demand was going to continue to go up, but fewer than half expected that their funding was going to rise. Again, we've got a recurrent theme here in terms of the gap between the resources necessary and the demand for the services. So that's something we'll come back to in the what do we do department. We also, though, we didn't just ask about funding, we asked about other things. We asked organizations, what are the top issues that are affecting your individual's organization viability over the next few years? We say aside from funding, but we allow room for financial issues. And in addition, we also ask, what are some of the top issues affecting the viability of the nonprofit community as a whole, as a sector in the coming decade. But starting with individual vulnerabilities, individual issues, concerns, these are all issues, or most of them are issues that have to do with infrastructure and strengthening operations and strengthening capacity to actually do the work. So this year, need for better branding and communications came out on top as being identified by the most respondents as one of their key issues, followed by financial uncertainty, no surprise there, and the need for a stronger board. These are all issues that tend to go into the top 5 in our surveys year after year. Similar recurring themes: the increased costs of benefits and insurance, the inability to afford enough good staff to actually do the work, increased demand for program services, and in this year, the need to increase advocacy and public policy to respond to the trends that organizations are experiencing. Again, if you look at the top several results here, we're talking about capacity, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about investing in systems that make nonprofits strong. You have a similar theme when respondents talk about the state of the nonprofit community as a whole. What is affecting the viability and well-being of the nonprofit community as a sector? And again, you've got issues about the need for nonprofit infrastructure and capacity building. That was number 1 this year. Foundation and corporate funding is number 2, tied with the need for a stronger board, making sure that you can attract and retain the right people to serve on nonprofit boards. Government issues, the state fiscal policy and budget issues, giving and volunteering incentives, certainly with the passage of tax reform, that was very high on everybody's mind and what that means. Federal budget issues, and advocacy rights, which is also part of the tax reform debate. And one issue that has risen very strongly in visibility since the past couple of surveys is the issue of diversity and equity and inclusion within nonprofits. This was identified by more than a quarter of our respondents as one of the top issues that nonprofits need to be facing. And this shows an elevation of awareness. It demonstrates how much work we do have to do on this, but in prior years, it didn't even crack 16%. So this is definitely an indicator of increased awareness of what needs to happen in the nonprofit community. What else did nonprofits tee up as issues? We put a lot of open-ended responses in our surveys because we don't pretend to know everything that's going on or everything that nonprofits are concerned about. So we allowed people plenty of time to write in virtually what was going on. So there were some recurring themes. We heard a lot about uncertainty about the impact of the new federal tax law. That is something that we've been presenting about in various webinars and in-person sessions. There are more coming up. I'll talk about that in a minute. The issue of government funding, the fact that if you do have a contract or government grant, that often does not cover the cost of providing services. Expenses have continued to rise while contracts have not increased in many, many years. This obviously puts stressors on nonprofit systems and has implications for service delivery. The impact of proposed employment law changes in the state of New Jersey, things like the minimum wage and earned family leave, things that are very, very important to provide, but also the concern, especially among organizations that have fixed revenues, especially from government, about will there be room to make adjustments, or how these things can be paid for. That's a really important issue, and it's a tension for nonprofits, to be sure. Organizations who are serving immigrant populations have expressed wide array of concern about being able to reach people who might be reluctant to seek help in the current climate. Certainly budget concerns, what will happen to funding for key programs, that's an ongoing concern among our respondents. It's not strictly social programs that tended to be expressed in other venues as well. There are some opportunities that have arisen. Everything, you can try to find an opportunity at anywhere, of course, but there are some opportunities, certainly for partnerships between and among nonprofits and for-profits and government. Several identified the new administration in Trenton as being a good opportunity to advance key issues and concerns. Organizations are paying attention to leadership development and succession planning and trying to get their house in order to make room for emerging leaders, develop new staff. It's both an opportunity and a concern, considering some organizations are having difficulty affording those staff. And the other key trend that has been identified, and I've certainly seen it personally, is heightened civic engagement, more willingness and motivation to be involved in the public policy stage, to be involved in nonpartisan voter engagement and voter activities, and many, many other kinds of issues and activities and initiatives beyond the specific service that nonprofits may be core to a specific organization. Much more attention to being involved in public policy. So what else are nonprofits doing in response to the trends that they're experiencing? Again, a lot of things here that you may know firsthand, be doing yourself, or may have experienced or seen. Chief among them, of course, if times are tough and revenues are challenged, you're going to try to find more. So whether that's through increased, trying to find funding from alternative sources, pooling resources, joint fundraising campaigns, trying to explore new sources of revenue through entrepreneurial ventures or other things. That's clearly a very, very frequently done activity. Increased volunteer recruitment, again, going back to what John and Sally said, finding ways to leverage resources, not only within organizations, but partner with others who have skills and expertise and resources to bear. Increased advocacy, I've seen it quite a bit over the last year and a half. Certainly, program adjustment, budget adjustments are ongoing. Organizations need to take careful look at everything they're doing and either adjust if the money isn't there. Some expansions have been noted to adapt to changes in populations and other factors. So you've got a real mixed bag in terms of, some organizations are seeing a lot of opportunity and being able to take advantage of them. Other organizations are looking to retrench. And then there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the donor pool because, again, the impact of tax reform is still far from evident, and in New Jersey, there's still some causes for concern. We asked organizations every year, are you better off now than you were a year ago? And then we also asked, do you think you'll be better off next year than you are now? And we have trend data from 2008 and before, but this chart lays out from 2008. This year, little over half of our respondents said that they were better off this year. Circumstances were better than they were at the same time a year before. About a third of our respondents said that their circumstances were unchanged. Looking ahead to 2018, less than half of our respondents thought that the next year would bring an improvement in their circumstances. That is a dip. They've been dipping steadily for the past 3 years or so. If you notice, we had a peak in 2015 where almost 2/3 of our respondents thought that they would be better off in a year. And that has gradually started to slip to, as I said, this year under half. And of course, if you look at the 35%, too early to tell, that's not unexpected. There's just so much going on, so many different factors at play. A lot of organizations simply just don't want to hazard a guess, and that is, again, to be understood. So what does this mean? Every year we ask, what do you think is going to happen? How has this panned out from year to year? This is what one of our friends dubbed the Metro chart, but what it actually does is it tracks last year's responses to this year's outcome. So the survey the year prior where organizations predicted how they were going to make out versus how they really did. So for example, the dotted green line represents from year to year the percentage of organizations that predicted that they were going to be better off in the next year. The solid line is what actually happened. And so the green is better off, the yellow is the same, unchanged, and the red is organizations that actually made out or predicted that their circumstances would be worse. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, only to say that except for 2008, when you had the financial crash and nobody could have predicted that, organizations have been pretty good at tracking where they end up. Those that predicted that they'd be better off actually tended, with some fluctuation, to become better off. Organizations, the middle size area, the midpoint, about either unchanged or don't know, again, are tracking about the same, and the organizations that are predicting that their circumstances will worsen have in fact largely tracked that way. So all this to say, when 53% of our respondents predict, or 44% predict, that they're going to be better off, then it's kind of like a confidence index. So it's helpful to track it over time. Of course, the big wild card in this year's predictions is tax reform. It's not the only variable, of course, but it's one of the biggest ones. As I said, we have been doing sessions about this in person and online. We did one, we participated in one with Sobel back in February, and we're doing some others. For those of you who will be in the Lawrenceville area, Princeton Area Community Foundation is hosting one this Thursday, April 12th. And I will be part of a presentation on that if anybody is able to and interested in participating. All this to say, as far as tax reform goes, not going to spend a lot of time on it, except to say the big issues with nonprofits and tax reform, of course, is the deductibility of charitable gifts. Under tax reform, more taxpayers are taking the standard deduction. Fewer of them are itemizing, which means fewer of them are able to take advantage of the tax incentive. The projections are that this is going to result in less charitable giving for charities to the tune of $12 to $20 billion in lost giving a year. Again, we want to make sure that organizations are aware of this, but also try to adapt in terms of how you engage with donors and the conversations that you have. We know that the giving incentive is not the only reason or even the primary reason that most people give, but it does have an impact. It has an impact in how much a donor may give, when a donor will give. There's no accident that so much giving takes place in the last week of the year, forget about just the last month. So there's a lot at stake here, and we collectively are still unpacking the impact of tax reform. We have a lot of information about this, so anybody who's interested, just shoot us an email or get in touch with us, and we'd be happy to share what we've got. There's also a lot on our website. So I've been throwing a lot of statistics out at you. I've been throwing out numbers about what nonprofits are doing and how they're trending and who received more funding and who didn't. Why do we care? Well, it goes back to what we talked about before. New Jersey needs a strong nonprofit community, both because of the services and the programs and the intangible and tangible amenities that nonprofits provide, but also because of the economic piece, the work that nonprofits do to make the economy strong, make New Jersey a place where people want to live and work and raise families and locate businesses. All of this is very, very connected to a strong nonprofit community. This is not supposed to be a precise graph. It's supposed to just be a visual depiction of the trend I talked about before. For years now, we're talking over a decade, probably even much longer than that, nonprofits have had the resources squeezed in terms of the rising demand compared with the funding that's not keeping pace, resulting in a gap in capacity that nonprofits are very creative in terms of trying to fill. But over time, we've got an issue here, folks. It's not sustainable. And while this is not a graph, maybe there's another way that I like to present this that may be a little bit closer to home. These Jenga Towers are a symbolic representation of a good, strong, solid nonprofit. You see all the blocks are in place, the base is sturdy, the tower is strong, everything is in good shape. Over time, as the as organizations are called on to add more services, add to their workload without any increases in funds, you start to see some holes in the structure. In some places, by some appearances, things will seem to be fine and the tower is not in such bad shape. But you start to keep asking organizations to take on more and more and more without providing the resources needed, or if organizations have to continually make those kinds of choices of putting off investing in their infrastructure, investing in technology, investing in staff development, compensating people fairly, all of these things that we know are part of a good business, it takes its toll. It takes its toll on the structure and it starts to weaken. And you keep doing this and there's an impact. The structure starts to collapse, and we've seen it happen, and it can be devastating for the people who are depending on organizations for services or for spiritual enrichment or for any of the qualities and attributes that nonprofits provide. This is what continuously and unceasingly doing more with less looks like. And it's not sustainable, and we have to do something about it. So what can we do? First and foremost, we can speak out. And speaking out includes all levels of communications, be they in government, outside of government, with your funders, with your partners, with your boards. Have this conversation about what sustainability means, what it takes for nonprofits to be able to thrive so that they can be there for the communities that need them. Certainly, we've seen a lot more in the way of engagement in public policy, and that is critically important. It's not the only way, but certainly if you're not involved or have not been as involved as you want to be, this is a perfect opportunity to be involved in a nonpartisan way, because policymakers need your input. They rely on it. We have a lot of information about this. If you are interested or if you're not quite sure where the boundaries are, talk to the center. We're happy to provide more information. Keep telling the story. Tell that story about how important nonprofits are, your organization, economically as well as socially, what nonprofits bring to the landscape, how nonprofits make lives better. The Center for Nonprofits tries to do this through initiatives like this survey, like our forthcoming salary, compensation, and diversity survey. Watch your email because we'll ask you to participate in that as well. Providing presentations to policymakers, talking to the media. This is something that it doesn't happen overnight, but you need to reinforce the message, because we need to stop the conversations that are hurting us in terms of the assumptions about how nonprofits operate and what they need to succeed and what makes a good nonprofit. There are things that can be done in terms of the government nonprofit partnerships, ways to strengthen them, and we are working on this, and I know many others are working on lots of different fronts. How can we streamline bureaucracy? How can we reform the contracting system so that it costs less to comply? Not everything, there are efficiencies to be found if some reforms can be enacted, and we've been working with partners to try to do that. So there's more that will be said, and we'll go on with that. Strengthening charitable giving incentives. There has been legislation reintroduced on the state level that would provide a state-level charitable giving incentive. New Jersey is one of the minority of states that doesn't have one, and especially since we've taken such a hit on federal tax reform, this is something that we think legislators ought to consider very carefully. We think it would be a great driver of revenue it's good for taxpayers who might have taken a hit because of federal tax reform. This would also be open to non-itemizers, which is really important to us because that allows people at all levels to give generously and to stretch the ability to give. That's something that we are trying to promote more aggressively. We also want to advocate federally to try to restore more giving incentives, trying to implement a universal or what's called an above-the-line tax deduction so that more people would be able to give and be rewarded for it. What else? There's certainly more, and I'll be opening it up to questions and comments in just a moment, because again, I decided to go very, very quickly through this presentation. The biggest thing is just to stay informed and stay educated. It can be such a challenge right now because so much is swirling in the news, so much in the policy arena is going on at once. The analogy of whack-a-mole is really kind of apt, where you're just trying to beat back challenge after challenge after challenge, or address issue after issue after issue. It can be very, very challenging, but if you stay connected with friends and colleagues, then it's a whole lot easier to bear the load, and it's a whole lot easier to not miss something. If you're not invested in advocacy, absolutely is the perfect time to do it. There's so much to be done and so much impact that you can have. For any organization, you can consult the literature as far as the elements of an effective organization, and community engagement is a big part of that, and advocacy is a big part of community engagement. If you haven't been looking at diversifying your revenue streams, this is a great time to do that as well. Any time is a good time to do that. You always want to do what you can to avoid being too dependent on a single source of funds, and organizations have been doing that for quite some time. Take a look at your programs, and with a critical and clear eye. If a program, you can do cost-benefit analyses of your programs. We do them periodically at the center because we want to know from a revenue in, revenue out perspective, if something is not sustaining itself in its own right, it's possible that we want to keep it going because it can be subsidized elsewhere, and it's important enough to do that. But you need to do it with your eyes open. So you need to take a look at your programs so that you can prioritize what is the most important, especially if resources should go south. Collaborate. Nonprofits always get, I think, too bad a rap for being seen as not collaborating. I actually see quite a bit of it, but there are always new opportunities to do that, and lots of different ways to establish synergies and whatnot and make connections. This is the great time to change the conversation with your funders, with your donors. Have that honest discussion about what your organization is experiencing, what it needs, what a donor or funder may be able to assist with, or other suggestions that they may be able to make. Again, it's one of these situations where if you don't have the conversation, it's really, really hard to move forward. And that also means asking some questions. Especially, and I'm going back to tax reform, we've seen that there are some that are benefiting or stand to benefit in a pretty substantial way from tax reform. It is possible to have a conversation in a diplomatic way to find out what the plans are for the future for those entities and people who are in a position to maybe do more because they might be making out pretty well when tax reform is all said and done. Ask your funders to and engage in practices that support real cost funding. Real cost funding, or what it takes funding, means funding the full cost of nonprofit work. That starts with us as nonprofits in making budgets that are truly reflective of what the work costs. Don't skimp on the indirect costs. Don't skimp on overhead if that's what it takes to do your program and to keep your organization as a business sustainable. And promote that investment in capacity building, leadership development, infrastructure, R&D. No for-profit organization that wants to be around over the long term is going to skimp on those things over the long term, and nonprofits shouldn't do it either. And of course, keeping the communications flowing. This is a two-way or multi-way street, and that's how we stay informed, that's how we stay ahead of trends, and that's how we can address them and continue to advance. And we need to stand together. That's, again, kind of goes without saying, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's one of the wonderful things about being in this field. Nonprofits are really good at having each other's backs, and we need to do that now more than ever because there are challenges that have been in place, mounting. There are more on the horizon. There are opportunities, but this is our chance to to partner up, to pool our resources, to stand up for each other so that we can continue to do the work that our communities need. I would be remiss if I didn't invite you once again to consider joining the center. Stand together as a member of the center. It's an investment both in your organization and in New Jersey's nonprofit community. It helps to support our work in advocating for the nonprofit community, on public policies, and in educational endeavors like this survey and others. It enables you to tap into learning and networking opportunities, some of which are exclusive to members. If you are hiring, you're a member, you can post your jobs for free. You have access to our experts on our staff. We have a fabulous staff team who are able to answer so many of your operational, compliance, referral questions. If you're looking for a resource, a consultant, an auditor, or any kind of service for nonprofits, we have a tremendous resource database that will hopefully be going online very, very soon, but we have one in-house and we can give you a lot of information. You get a substantial discount off of the New Jersey Nonprofit Conference on December 5th, and you can tap into a whole slew of other savings that can easily offset what are fairly modest dues to begin with. So that's my invitation to consider center membership, and there's more information about that on our website, and certainly feel free to get in touch with us and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about that. By way of a reminder, at the conclusion of the webinar, the survey will be up on our website, and you'll be able to tap into it from the home page, and we will and we'll be able to also send it to you at the conclusion of the webinar. I understand that there is a question, so if you bear with me while I pull it up. The question has to do with how should organizations change the dialogue with funders, how to address the myth, the insensitivity, or lack of awareness. What can organizations emphasize? And how can organizations counteract the myth that some of the problems that nonprofits are experiencing are as a result of their own making? Let me start with how to change the conversation with funders. I think there are a few different ways, and I encourage people to type in their success stories into the chat box, and I'm happy to share them to read them out. I think it starts with relationship building. In the ideal world, when somebody is a donor, you are not just communicating with them to either thank them for their check or to ask them for the next one. Hopefully you are finding other ways to involve them in your activities, either as a volunteer or making sure that they understand the results of what you are doing. There's more than one way to evaluate work effectively or to demonstrate impact, and a lot of organizations are doing a very good job at that. Some activities, quite honestly, are harder to evaluate than others, but there are a lot of different ways to demonstrate the impact and the difference that nonprofits are making. And both, again, from a substantive standpoint, from a human standpoint, as well as from an economic one. So part of this is keeping those lines of communications open so that what you can say is that you're pointing at the results. This is what your donation is funding, and it's not about the flawed metric of how much did you spend on admin last week. There's been widespread acknowledgement that those kinds of metrics really are insufficient. So some of it is a question of regular conversations. Some of the things, when you have conversations with the policymakers that you're building relationships with, if you are the type of organization that has a great story to tell by way of seeing your facility, invite them to visit. So some of this is it's a long-term effort because, quite honestly, we have decades of misinformation to overcome. But if we're all speaking the same message and not buying into and reinforcing the faulty metrics, that's going to go a long way to changing the conversation. The other, and I think that's part of the answer to the other question: how do we respond to the concerns that nonprofits kind of made this bed, or that there's incompetency in the nonprofit community? There are a couple of ways. One is strictly education about just how much nonprofits are able to leverage resources, to have impact, to make differences in lives, given a lot that not a lot of folks would be able to succeed in doing. So I think some of it will be, success will be its own reward. The other piece of this, though, is that it is important and essential to invest in capacity building and to hold nonprofits to a high standard of competence and effectiveness. There are resources to be had, there's assistance to be had, and we can help connect, and we and others certainly either provide it or can help connect people to it. But it is incumbent upon us to, starting with our boards, starting with our staff teams, to insist on quality, to insist on excellence, to insist on upholding the highest levels of ethics and accountability, so that what we're doing is as above reproach as possible. That's a bit of a vague response, but a lot of the answer, I think, is in communication. It's in investment in capacity, and it's in partnerships and learnings. So that's probably the best answer I can give right now, but certainly encourage other suggestions. I'm looking to see if there are other questions. The other question: do we share this report with legislators, and how can we help get this information to our elected representatives? Great question. I'm so glad you asked. We will be sharing this with legislators. We'll be sending this the link via email. We don't like to send attachments in email because they tend to be kicked out. But this is just day one of trying to circulate this information. The other thing you need to know is that the information in this survey and other research that we gather, and either that we do ourselves or find elsewhere, finds its way into all sorts of communications that we make with legislators. For example, we were fortunate enough to be invited to participate in Foundations on the Hill with the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers. So we went to Washington. We met with a number of members of Congress and their staffs, and the information that we left behind included the kinds of statistics and data that we gather in this survey. And it helps to reinforce the message about how important it is to maintain and to nurture a strong and thriving nonprofit community. So it's part of a matrix of information, and it's part of what helps to reinforce our message when we go to policymakers. And that's the kind of thing that you can use as well, because, and we've seen policymakers use this data when they're promoting their own legislation. So it all fuels on top of itself, and it builds in a very good and influential way. So we encourage all sorts of things to do this. We'll also be developing, it's not ready yet, but we will be developing infographics that will be a little bit more accessible in terms of some of the key pieces of information. So stay tuned for a lot more information about that. But if there's something that you are looking for that you don't see us providing, or information that you're looking for the nonprofit community, ask. And if we are either aware that it exists, we'll certainly share it. And if it's something that would make for a really important research project, we will see if we can't make that happen. I'm looking to see if there are other questions, comments. I lost the chat box. At this point, I think that may be it. So at this point, let me just encourage you to stay connected with us. We have various communications channels through social media, currently Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Please join our email list as well. We do not spam you, so you will get notices about important policy initiatives, advocacy alerts, upcoming events, other news you can use. So definitely sign up for our email list. Sometimes the breaking news will go up on social media first. So if you are able to follow us on our social media.
I see a couple of extra questions here. I mean, we could always address these in an email.
Well, we have time, so have at it.
Okay, Sam is asking, do you think there are opportunities for consolidation of nonprofits, and how would that happen?
The short answer is yes, there are always opportunities. Some can be more deliberate and affirmative and purposeful than others. They're along the collaboration spectrum. Of course, you can start with just basic loose associations and coexistence and coordination of activities or co-promotion on all the way up to what I think Sam is asking about, which is mergers and consolidations. Some of this is already happening. It's always a smallish segment of our respondent pool who say they were either considering a merger, that they actually completed one. I believe in this survey it was something along the lines of maybe 5% said they had actually completed a merger, but maybe 15% or so said they were considering it. So there are ways, and it's been happening, especially I've seen more of them recently in the mental health field with the advent of some of the fee-for-service funding changes that has prompted some organizations to choose to consolidate. So some of it's willing and purposeful and affirmative, and some consolidation, quite frankly, may take the form of attrition as some organizations end up having to close if the impact of some of the developments is not favorable. But there are resources and organizations and attorneys and other consultants who specialize in helping organizations work through that kind of decision making, trying to assess whether it is a good time to establish a formal merger, and they can walk through the pros and cons. Our counterpart in New York, the New York Council of Nonprofits, does quite a bit of this. The Support Center for Nonprofit Management here in New Jersey, Keith Timko is on our board, does quite a bit of this as well, to name just two. So there are a lot of ways to approach this purposefully. The only thing last thing I'll say on that front is it's always better to have this kind of exploration when you are not in a position of distress. You want to approach this from a position of strength that makes you a good merger partner, and then you can go from there as far as examination of the many other factors that might make a merger advisable and successful.
Okay, another question. I don't know if you addressed this. Are there any specific nonprofits that are particularly experiencing larger capacity issues?
By larger capacity issues, meaning more severe capacity issues, I hear about them pretty regularly. I would have to go back and look at the survey to see if there was anybody who identified that as an issue who was willing to be named. We do ask in our survey if respondents would like us to share their stories, and some of them do indicate that they are willing to do that, but I would have to go back and look at the survey. So that's something I can try to follow up on if something materializes. The short answer, the other short answer is I know that capacity is an issue in a lot of different ways. It's the resource gap, it's the staffing issue, it's the affordability issue, it's the staff shortage issues. There are a lot of different relevant threads to that.
This question is regarding industry specifics, such as human services versus arts versus direct care.
In terms of were there variations in the survey between those subsectors, the short answer is yes. The general trend about rising demand was true across the board. The resource gaps were especially pronounced in human service and health organizations, but it certainly wasn't exclusive to them. In the full report, there are some areas where we delineate where some trends might have been more prevalent in one subsector than another.
Okay, and we'll follow up with Paulina on some of these questions. Maureen is asking, were there any surprises from the survey this year?
I think perhaps Perhaps the biggest surprise, and I don't necessarily say that it was a surprise, because I was expecting it last year and it didn't happen, and that was the increased attention to issues of equity and diversity. I had expected that last year it would be identified by more respondents as one of their top 5 issues, and it didn't happen. But this year, as I said, more than a quarter of our respondents, I think it was 28%, said that this was one of the most important issues that nonprofits as a community need to grapple with. So I find that to be very encouraging. As I said, a pleasant surprise in the sense that I'm glad to see it getting attention. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done there. That's probably the biggest surprise that I found.
And the survey is now on our website, so anybody can check it out.
Wonderful. I'll invite any other last-minute questions or thoughts before wrapping things up. Okay, hearing none, let me just take one more moment to thank all of you for being on today's briefing. I want to thank any organization that took the time to complete the survey. Certainly want to thank Sobel and Company and the Horizon Foundation for New Jersey for their generous support of this report. And by all means, please keep the lines of communication open. We need to know what you're experiencing, what you're concerned about, what the opportunities are. Let us know what you need, and we would love to be able to assist you. And we want to work together because we're always stronger when we work together. Thank you again for taking the time. We will be following up with the recording and the slides and a PDF of the report, the link to the report PDF. And if you want to get it sooner, then go to our website. Thank you so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.